So it's my pleasure to chair this session this evening and introduce Hugh Lovatt, who is our guest speaker, and to welcome you all. Of course, most of you from South Warwickshire, but a few from beyond, and a special welcome to you. So Hugh is a senior policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa programme at the ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations. He is very much focused on the Middle East, a real expert on the Middle East, and gets asked for advice by all sorts of organisations. He's often quoted in media in relation to Middle East issues, particularly around Palestine. He advises a cross-party group of MPs and members of the House of Lords that meets on a monthly basis. And he's also an advisor to a group of European parliamentarians that also meets on a fairly regular basis. And he chairs the Brussels-based European Middle East project. So we have a real expert in our midst this evening, and look forward to Hugh talking to us. Hugh's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions and discussion. If you have questions that you'd like to put to Hugh, or indicate you would like to ask a question, please indicate so in the chat, and we'll try and make sure that all issues are covered. So over to you, Hugh.
Thank you, Tim.
Could those of you who are not speaking, by the way, please go on mute so that Hugh can speak without interruptions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you, Belinda, for co-hosting, and a pleasure to be with you, at least virtually. Unfortunately, I've never made it to Leamington Spa, but it's definitely on my list of places to come visit. So I've been asked to talk a bit about Israel-Palestine. Firstly, I should say it's a very important caveat that despite our very confusing name, European Council on Foreign Relations, we have no relationship to the European Union, no official relationship. So please don't blame me for how awful the EU's policy is. So what I will do is I'll talk a bit about the situation today, a bit about how we got here. I won't do the whole history because we don't have time for that, but sort of some of the main takeaways of why we're here today, and perhaps then talk a bit about where things may go in the future. And this is sort of, as John was saying, this is sort of drawing on my work on this issue for now about a decade, advising a number of organizations, also European foreign ministries, and a number of research trips out in Israel-Palestine. I'm actually going there on Saturday again. So where are we today? So the title, as you might have heard from the title of this briefing, the post-Oslo paradigm. So my view is that up until, well, quite recently, we were in what I would call the sort of Oslo two-state paradigm. And this is a paradigm that was born out of the Oslo Accords, starting in 1993. And that was very much premised around two things, peace negotiations and the two-state solution. And I think it's important to clarify this, because in the way I see things, you have a strategy and a political objective. The strategy was negotiations as they were described or configured through the Oslo Accords, which sort of, set up the international choreography for how diplomacy would work and how the two sides were supposed to move forward through negotiations to reach a final agreement. So that's the strategy, it's the Oslo bit. The objective was two states, was a two-state solution, and two states has not always been an agreed upon objective. It wasn't prior to the late 1980s when the Palestinians were still pushing for liberation of all of historical Palestine as they saw it. It has not always been embraced by the Zionist movement, by past Israeli governments. And we'll talk a bit about their relationship to the two-state solution today. And without going into all the nitty-gritty of the reasons and the laborious negotiations over the last 25 years or more, what I do want to draw out is 2 or 3 reasons why things failed. And I think the first one is that clearly the way that the peace process was configured, in many ways, it sidelined international law. So the Palestinians made 2 compromises, in my view. They made a first compromise, which was to renege on their previous claims to liberate, as they saw it, historical Palestine. So they compromised to a territorial division. But in many ways, perhaps unwittingly, they also agreed to displace international law. So under international law, Israel would have to withdraw from the occupied territories, full stop. Through negotiations, because it's a political compromise, the two sides have to agree, which gives Israel much more of a say over how and when it would actually withdraw from the territories. And so I think this was one of the fundamental weaknesses. It sort of watered down what, in my view, are very clear international legal determinations. And we've seen these determinations, legal determinations, play out in other situations without drawing parallels, of course. But how we just look at Ukraine and what's happening there, and how strong our support for international law, and we would never dream of negotiating Ukraine's territorial compromise or giving up territories to Russia. But in the case of Israel-Palestine, we have supported a peace process which involves the Palestinians giving up territory. And what this has done is, I think it's increased the asymmetry between the sides, between the Palestinian movement and Israel. As I said, it's allowed Israel to determine how and when to move forward with negotiations and the outcome of a future agreement. And of course, what this has done, in my view, is it's entrenched and exasperated dynamics that predated the Oslo Accords. So of course, things did not start with the Oslo Accords. We've had, I'm not going to go back to 1948 and to the foundation of Israel, but if you only pick like 1967, which is the beginning of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, we saw, very quickly the Israeli government launching a clear policy to settle those territories. And we have now access to a lot of the archives and declassified minutes of the Israeli internal deliberations in the Israeli government about how they were going to settle the West Bank, and also the status that they wanted to accord the West Bank, which was, when even in 1967, it was trying to decide or to try to pick a fate for the West Bank that was somewhere between full Israeli annexation, which they didn't want, and full independence for the Palestinians, which they didn't want. And so even in 1967, they were talking about maybe something in between, where Palestinians had self-rule, but not independence. And again, as I said, you already started to see the settlement activities. So when the peace process came along, in my view, it kind of acted as a cover, or even as a accelerator or enabler of a lot of these Israeli policies, so to settle, to maintain hold over the occupied territories, but to try to delegate day-to-day control of the territories to the Palestinians. And again, then we have the creation of the Palestinian Authority that was part and parcel of the state of the Oslo peace process. And I think the other big issue is, I think it's quite apparent, is that in the Oslo Accords, you do not have sufficient international guarantees, enforcement mechanisms, and accountability. So if a side reneges on commitments, what would be the consequence? If Israel continues to build settlements, what is the consequence? So on and so forth. And there were no consequences because there were no provisions. And so, and obviously, I think there was also a clear lack of international willingness to hold the parties to account. So in this situation, what happened is that actually you ended up, again, with a consolidation of a reality that was neither, full independence for the Palestinians, nor full annexation by Israel. This reality of what I would call permanent Israeli control and unequal rights for Palestinians. And this is actually also the language that the European Union has used. It talks about a reality of unequal rights for Palestinians and open-ended occupation. A number of international organizations call this apartheid. And so I think the peace process, because it's so dysfunctional, or it has become so dysfunctional, it has become an enabler of this reality, as far as I can see it. So instead of moving the parties towards a future agreement that would end the occupation, it is actually enabling and managing the occupation. And I can go into more detail, but I think that's sort of the key headline. And I think one of the consequences of this also is that the international community, though, has been very supportive of the peace process for a variety of reasons. Even now, if you look at communication, if you look at declarations from the UK, from the European Union, they continue to support the Oslo peace process paradigm. They continue to support and call for negotiations. But the consequences is that this has in many ways actually come at the expense of any international action to end the occupation. So they won't take the UK, the European Union, the US will not do anything that could prejudice the peace process, which means that they will not, for example, want to recognize Palestine. They will not want to support Palestinian action at the International Criminal Court, etc., because they worry that that could undermine a peace process, even though, as I said, in my view, there is no peace process anymore and it's completely dysfunctional. But I think it shows you how much the UK and the European Union and others are really stuck in a mantra of a peace process that is going nowhere, and actually, I think, deepening issues. And so this leads us to where we are today, because I think it's, it's not like the peace process is actually, you could, if you're very cynical, you say, well, maybe it's not leading to a full agreement, maybe it's not leading to a two-state solution, but at least it's managing the conflict. I completely disagree. The peace process is not managing the conflict, it's managing the occupation. And at the same time, we don't have, the peace process has not been able to freeze the situation as it was in 1993. The trajectory since then continues to be one of deterioration on the ground. And I'll talk about this shortly, but also in terms of the health of the two-state solution. And I think this is posing real consequences for Israelis, the Palestinians, and the international community. In terms of what's happening on the ground, I think one of the other consequences of this very dysfunctional peace process is the impact that it's had on the Palestinian national movement. So I mentioned how, the creation of the Palestinian Authority, and in my view, yes, this was celebrated by the PLO, by the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat allowed the PLO to come back to the West Bank. So in that regard, it's seen as a win. But actually, if you look at it from, if you take a step back and you see that this is actually an idea that was already thought about in 1967 by the then Israeli government as a way to manage its occupation, then I think it can start to give you a sense of of the trap in which Palestinians have found themselves. And so one of the consequences of this is that now, the Palestinian national movement, as embodied by the PLO, Fatah, now Mahmoud Abbas, the president, is at its weakest moment. Perhaps, maybe not ever, but at least since the 1980s, when the PLO was kicked out of Beirut. We have a fracturing of the Palestinian liberation movement, the delegitimization of the Palestinian liberation movement, a complete loss of direction, of ideas, of strategy. And needless to say, this is not great. It's not great for Palestinians, but it's also not great for Israel, because in a situation where you have this Palestinian national movement that is fracturing, it is not able to do even what Israel wants it to do, which is to maintain control of the territories. Clearly, we're all aware of Gaza and Hamas is controlling what's happened. But what's happening today in the West Bank, north of the West Bank, is a complete loss of PA control. And in my view, we are kind of moving towards another intifada in the north. Like, we have daily shooting attacks against Israeli targets in the West Bank, daily raids, Israeli raids that kill Palestinians in Nablus and Jenin. The Israeli army has announced, or the Israeli defense minister, Gantz, has announced that they might start using drone strikes against targets in Nablus, Jenin, in the West Bank, which they haven't done before. So this situation, I don't want to take away agency from Palestinians and the issues on the Palestinian side, but this situation is part and parcel of a dysfunctional peace process, as I described it. And to me, it's sadly not unsurprising. And you cannot have a legitimate, coherent Palestinian leadership whose only task is to enforce the occupation. But in other words, if you're not going to give the Palestinian leadership political wins, if you're not going to give Palestinians themselves a sense that things are moving forward, then clearly you're going to have to face the consequences that unfortunately we see now in the West Bank. When it comes to the health of the two-state solution, this is another huge danger. So while what's happening in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, also violence, that's the immediate consequence. The longer-term consequence is now, what is the health of the two-state solution? Is it dead or not? Which a lot of people talk about, right? And I think just briefly on that, how to measure the health of two states, it's part physics, part politics. So the physics is, where does Israel build a settlement unit? Which part of the West Bank? Does it sever the West Bank between north and south? Does it sever East Jerusalem from the West Bank hinterland? Like all these geographical, physical questions. And so the answer to that would be, well, if you just sort of build settlements, keep them close to the border, it will be fine. But there's politics as well, because the problem is wherever you build a settlement, whenever you add a settler, you're increasing the political cost that any future Israeli government will have to pay to make a two-state solution possible. So I think this is the other thing. And also with the empowerment of the settler movement, you also see the erosion of, I think, what was a real constituency in favor of two states 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And very briefly, I think I want to address one point, because we had Prime Minister Lapid coming out in support of two states at the UN. As ever, I think it's very important. What are the caveats? What are the details? What are the terms and conditions? Now, having spent 10 minutes, 15 minutes me saying how bad the Oslo peace process was, the one thing it did do through successive rounds of negotiations is it did, in my view, give a very clear idea, not even idea, a clear outline of what a two-state solution would look like. And actually, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not complicated. How to resolve the conflict in Libya, how to resolve the civil war in Syria, those are called Yemen, those are hugely complex questions. I don't think anyone has an answer to. How to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on two states is very simple. And we know it because we've done it. Like there was an informal, non-official initiative called the Geneva Initiative in 2003 that actually was able to reach an agreement. So it had former Israeli and former Palestinian negotiators, they reached an agreement. So while we don't know absolutely every single detail that would be agreed between the parties, we know the contours. Bill Clinton spelled those out in 2000. There've been iterations since then. I was involved in what's called a track 2, in sort of informal dialogue, that we also came out with our parameters. And so they're very clear in terms of what would need to be achieved, which is, as we all know, East Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital, Palestinian state based on like 6-7 borders with land swaps, some sort of right of return for Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. Previous Israeli governments agreed to this. Now, when you get into like the negotiations, there's always a question about how many Palestinian refugees, exactly which settlements, so on and so forth, which obviously did bedevil negotiations, but there was an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians what the terms of reference would be. Lapid, when he comes out with two states, I don't think he could agree to those parameters. He could not agree to the parameters that were previously endorsed by past Israeli governments, including right-wing governments. So Lapid has made clear that he would not divide Jerusalem. In the past, he's also said the Jordan Valley would not be given up in any deal, which is a hardening of previous Israeli positions, et cetera, et cetera. And I say this not to attack Lapid, but to say that I think Israeli perceptions of a two-state have also changed. And actually, when you start asking these follow-up questions, you realize that there really isn't much of a constituency that backs two-state as we in the international community and past Israeli governments used to understand it. And that actually where we're at today in the Israeli discourse is, I think there's basically two camps. There's the annexationist camp. So in my view, Israel is annexing and has annexed Palestinian territory. Obviously, it annexed East Jerusalem to Europe formally, but it's also been annexing Palestinian territory, what I call de facto, so through a variety of means, consolidating its control. Nevertheless, there is a camp in Israeli politics, I think Lapid is part of this, perhaps even Netanyahu, that does not want to formally annex. Because if you formally annex it, you create consequences for yourself in terms of what you do with the Palestinian population that's there. So there's this, I think I put Lapid and Netanyahu in what's called the control camp. So basically it's how do you manage the current model, occupation model, which Oslo was actually so good at creating. And then you have this annexationist camp, which I put Naftali Bennett and a lot of the settlers who want to actually apply formal sovereignty over the West Bank, or at least over large parts of the West Bank. The constituency that really backs two states, as the international community understands it, I think is extremely small, and probably Meretz, part of Labour, and the Arab parties. So obviously this is a huge consequence when you're looking at the future, because how do you create and where do you find a constituency in Israel that can back two states and the difficult decisions that would be needed to make for that to happen? And clearly the absence of two states creates huge existential dilemmas for Israel and for Israeli Jews and Jews, I would say, in that if you if you take all the territory and you take all the Palestinians, you have to decide whether you as a state are going to be a Jewish state in control of all the land, or a democratic state, but without a Jewish majority population. You'll have to choose between apartheid, or Israeli Jews will have to choose between apartheid or democracy and lose the Jewish characteristic. Because, quite simply put, if the two states is no longer on the table, you are in a one-state reality between the river and the sea, where you have parity in populations, parity in Jewish and non-Jewish populations, which creates this huge dilemma. So obviously, this is why two states is the option for so many people. But I think as an international community and non-Israelis, this is also something that we should actually reflect upon. You know, if two states is no longer possible, what is our response? Is it to turn a blind eye and to say, well, you know, we move on and we can accept permanent inequality and dress it up somehow, or actually take a much more difficult decision for some, which would be to actually, no, you need to move towards full equality, even if this means losing Israel's Jewish characteristic or Jewish majority characteristics. And I'll start wrapping up, but on the Palestinian side, you know, this sort of this sense that the two-state solution is dead, basically, is clearly quite prescient and is a subject of intellectual conversation amongst Palestinians. And clearly, there's now, I think, there's a question about alternative political objectives, going back to what I said right at the beginning. So if two states is not possible, from a Palestinian perspective, what would be the preferred outcome? But even here, we don't really have a clear answer yet from Palestinians. There's been ideas that have been suggested by Palestinians and Israeli Jews in terms of, you know, this idea of confederacy, which I'm very skeptical of, and we can talk a bit about. You know, I think a lot of Palestinians would much more prefer this idea of a unitary state where there's, you know, one citizen, one vote. But nonetheless, there's not yet a majority constituency to back an alternative political objective. And so I think this will take time to be able for Palestinians to clarify themselves. The problem is, so long as the Palestinians cannot clarify themselves, we're going to be again stuck in this, I think, this sort of gray zone, as it were, or this situation of one state reality of unequal rights. So I think to finish on this, I'd say where we're at the moment is that my idea of an Oslo two-state paradigm is dead. It doesn't mean two states is necessarily dead or not. And I think this is a conversation we can have. Everyone has a bit of a different perspective, but certainly the strategy is dead, if not the political objective as well. But we don't yet have an alternative paradigm that everyone agrees upon. For me personally, it's clear that the strategy has failed. So the Oslo strategy failed. So there needs to be a new approach in terms of how you can actually create the conditions that can allow for future negotiations. Because whether this is going to be two states or one state, it's going to have to be resolved through negotiations. Even if you look to you know, apartheid South Africa, the ANC negotiated with the Afrikaner government eventually. So the question is, how do you create that environment, that enabling environment that can make this work? Which means changing Israeli calculations for Israelis to realize that the continuation of the current status quo is wrong and dangerous for them. But also, I think there's a lot of housekeeping that needs to be done on the Palestinian side, which is another conversation. But as an external person, you know, who's neither Palestinian or Israeli nor Jewish, for me, the simple point is it should be about equality. Well, the choice should be inequality or equality. Obviously, I choose equality, but I think we need to be better at sort of framing what the contours of a future paradigm should be. And for me, it's, you know, whether you do one state or two states, it should be equality. Simple as that. And then finally, in terms of what the international community should be doing, which is a huge question. And I think, unfortunately, we're in a reality with this little appetite to do much. And not just in Israel-Palestine, but I think in general, when we look at especially European policy tools and UK policy tools in the Middle East, it's much more transactional at the moment. There's not much of an appetite to do the big transformative policy things that we saw perhaps 10, 15, 20 years ago. So the appetite is little. But I think at the minimum, it's about ensuring that governments do not double down on negative dynamics. So how you don't continue to strengthen Israeli perceptions that they can leapfrog over the Palestinians, that they can ignore the Palestinians, how to ensure that our relations with Israel, at the very least, are not reinforcing these negative dynamics, but also not contravening international law. So in the UK, for example, there's a lot of pieces of legislation that are going through Parliament that do just that. There's a so-called anti-BDS bill, which in my view has nothing to do with BDS. It's about limiting the ability of local councils to choose how to invest their pension funds, restricting them or preventing them from divesting not just from Israel or Israeli companies, but also settlement-linked companies. That legislation may also qualify Israeli territory as territory controlled by Israel, which means not just within the 67 borders, but also the settlements, which is a huge deal. It's basically the UK government de facto recognizing Israeli claims over the West Bank. Likewise, there'll be a new free trade agreement very soon between the UK and Israel. Will that include the settlements or not? I think that's still a question mark. So there's far more the UK could be doing, banning Israeli settlement products. Now that we've left the EU, we can do that. So there's a lot of stuff that can be done, but there's even like very simple things that are not being done at the moment. So let me finish there with that sort of that thought. There was one question before we started on the EU's Association Council meeting. So the EU has quite an important relationship with Israel, and it's always been trying to balance this relationship. So how to balance the relationship between our interests, because we have interests with Israel, where like most governments have and countries have interests, because it's security, trade, culture, cultural exchanges, etc., and values, which is supporting Palestinian rights, pushing for end of occupation, etc. And how governments in the EU have tried to balance those relationships has always been difficult, but it's always been a balancing act over the last 20 more years. Sometimes you go more towards interest, sometimes more towards values. I think at the moment we've swung all the way towards interests and this transactionalism. So we give lip service to the Palestinians, but ultimately do very little to advance their rights, or to talk about advanced two states and the occupation. And so this meeting, it's called the Association Council meeting between the EU, its member states, and Israel will be happening next Monday. And I think this is, again, would be probably a sad example of this, of how the EU itself is in this very transactional mode. And I'm personally not someone who would say you need to cut relations with Israel completely, because I think we have to have a functional relationship, etc. But at the same time, you cannot be, that relationship cannot be exasperating negative dynamics that will in the future undermine our own interests, in terms of negative dynamics that are fostering increased instability, violence, undermining two states, which remains the international objective. So I don't think it's right to be able to pursue this transactional relationship at the expense of what are also our key foreign policy objectives. But I think it also shows at the moment, especially in the EU, where the EU policy is completely lost on this topic and is behaving as if we're still in the 1990s, we're still in the Oslo peace process paradigm. Behaving like this because acknowledging that we're not would actually force a very difficult and serious policy discussion about what we do next. So with the ostrich and its head in the sand, it's better not to take your head out of the sand, pretend there's no problem. And maybe it works for the EU, maybe it works for the UK to have this very transactionalism. But unfortunately, it will at some point just foster more instability, and those who will lose will not just be the UK and our interests, but also sadly Israelis and Palestinians. So yeah, on that very pessimistic note.
Very good. So would anybody like to ask the first question? So who's waving? Chrissy Priestley, are you waving? No. David Bond, I see you have a question. You like to unmute yourself?
Yes. Hello. I'd like to ask a bit more about what you call the transactional relationship between the transactional nature of British relations with the Palestine-Israel question. would it not be in British interests to establish better relations with the Arab nations? Would a fairer response to the problem by Britain not improve relations in a way that would be desirable? Or, yeah, I mean, that's all. That's probably a naive question.
It's a good question. It's a very good question. And I think obviously interests are in the eye of the beholder. So myself or yourself may absolutely subscribe to that, that actually, if you want to move forward and actually have a better relationship or a better policy that can actually better advance and defend one's interests, having a more balanced, coherent policy, not just with Israel, but with Arab states, is actually fundamental to that, right? And I think actually, this is a bigger point, that actually transactionalism itself doesn't work. Put aside Israel, Palestine, because I think if you're transactional with other countries, they'll be transactional with you, and you can never actually, you're always going to be especially like when the UK and Europe is actually a supplicant quite often, because we want a free trade agreement, we want energy, we want etc. from the region. I think transactionalism is actually bad for us because it puts us in the position of asking, and actually if we have a more balanced and more coherent policy, and you're actually better able to exert influence. That's a broader point. I think specifically from the UK's point of view, clearly I don't think the Prime Minister would agree with that or see it exactly how I see it. But I would say two things, like there is transactionalism. I think especially with the UK, there is ideology. Clearly Liz Truss is hugely ideological on this issue in ways that perhaps previous prime ministers and other world leaders are not. That she does have a clear, close personal relationship with Prime Minister Lapid, is clearly very pro-Israel. And I think that is actually not just coloring her views, but also shaping UK policy. And that one of the few things she did as Secretary of State, or Foreign Secretary rather, was to initiate a review within the FCDO to actually change UK policy, to do less Middle East peace process and more cheerleading for Israel. But at the other point, again, if I can't not be pessimistic, is that actually, I think also Arab states are changing how they view the conflict. And so again, you do have the same accolades for the Palestinians, the same supportive statements. But I think what the Abraham Accords have shown is that actually, in substance, or a lot of Arab states actually don't care that much for the Palestinians. And maybe that's not actually fundamentally different from how it was a few decades ago. But a few decades ago, their interests dictated a more overt pro-Palestinian, or the domestic interest dictated a more pro-Palestinian stance. Well, now I think at the moment their interests dictate a more pro-Israel stance. Again, it comes back to this idea of transactionalism of interest. The UAE wants security, military, political cooperation with Israel. And the UAE, for example, has is allowing the sale of settlement products of wine from occupied Syrian territory in its duty-free shop at Dubai airport. It's signing agreements with Israel that include the settlements. So this is a very long answer to come back to you saying that. But in essence, I completely agree with you. But I think, unfortunately, the reality is that you're also dealing with an Arab side that they will call you hypocritical, but fundamentally, they're not going to do much to challenge a policy, a UK policy that's so clearly geared towards Israel and undermining the Palestinians, because they themselves are probably not doing something that's not massively dissimilar.
Belinda, you had a question.
Thanks very much, Hugh, for the comprehensive, if depressing analysis. Thanks also for answering the question I'd already put to you before we started about the EU Association Council. Just for everyone else, the meeting on Monday is significant because the last time they met, I think, was in 2013. And I think that Israel was unhappy because at that time, the EU was articulating its policy, what they call differentiation between dealing with Israel and with the settlements, which is why we would have agreements on research cooperation and other things, which specifically excluded the settlements, only dealt with Israel. And that risks getting muddied. So I've got another question, and it's about the leadership of the Palestinians. Promises of elections have come and gone. Abbas seems to like going to the UN, but perhaps is more popular when he's going around capitals in Europe and elsewhere than he is when he's back home. Do you see any prospect for change?
No.
Okay.
I think there was an announcement announcement of elections last year. So elections, legislative and presidential elections, were meant to have happened last year for the first time since 2005, 2006, respectively. I think that was the moment. If there was a lot of challenges, and I think had that moved forward, had we had elections at that time, I think we'd be on a completely different track, at least in terms of the internal Palestinian stuff. So I mentioned all the severe deterioration at the moment in the north of the West Bank. I think if we'd had elections last year, which would have required a change of leadership, and maybe probably also Abbas would have been gone, I think you would have a more legitimate Palestinian leadership, maybe a leadership that would be a bit more difficult to deal with from an international point of view, because maybe they wouldn't be supportive of the Oslo two-state paradigm, but they would have probably more legitimacy and be more better able to control what's happening. That was the moment. Like, I've worked on this for 10 years. That was one of the few moments, in my view, where things could have been different. Ultimately, Abbas did not want elections because he would have lost presidency, because there's no way he would have won presidential elections because he's so unpopular. And he would have lost not to a Hamas guy, because Hamas wasn't going to run in the presidential elections, but he would have lost to another Fatah candidate. That was the moment. And now we've passed, and I think, obviously this is the onus is on the Palestinians and especially the Palestinian leadership to make it happen. But I think also there was a lack of international enthusiasm for those elections. So when Abbas was wavering and thinking about cancelling, there was no one really seriously from Europe or from the US pressing him to continue to maintain elections, because we don't want to deal with the consequences of Abbas going. We don't want to deal with the consequences of Hamas potentially playing a role in the future government. So we much prefer the short-termism, thinking everything is fine. So now, I honestly, I think it's about waiting. I don't like to say this but waiting for Abbas to leave, die, and then trying to manage the massive instability and what happens in that scenario. I think is again very messy, but I don't see much at the moment. And unfortunately, that means things will get worse before they get better.
Thank you. Barclay Lane, you had a question?
Sorry, I was just making sure that you were able to hear me. You can, can't you? Yes, can you hear
Indeed.
me?
Yes.
Good. I'm tech phobic slightly. So yeah, thank you very much. That was fascinating. In my humble way, I see exactly where you're coming from and the reason for your pessimism. I unfortunately share it.
I was hoping for some optimism.
The party that has the upper hand clearly is Israel. It's at the moment is in a position of power in all kinds of different ways, and it acts largely with impunity. It seems to me that the only way of making it behave responsibly is for America, the USA, that is, to put considerable pressure on it. And I don't see that happening in the next few years, at least. And then that leaves us, the UK. That's the first question. The second question is, here we are in the UK, and I'm forever banging on about this, so apologies to everybody else, because you'll have heard this from me before, but I'm very interested in any ideas that you may have in how we can put further pressure, more influence on the British government, successive governments, or whatever you, to try and get them to, again, behave more responsibly to a worsening situation in the Middle East. One which will come in due course, if I'm right, I hope I'm not, and kick them up the behind, because it's going to hurt. We're not looking forward. So a mishmash of thoughts there, but any comments from you, please?
Thank you. I'm going to double down on the pessimism then. I think a lot of people are looking for the US, well, not just for leadership, for change as well, and including also, I think, Palestinians, and that I think a lot of Palestinian factions and Palestinians themselves have given up on Europe, including the UK, and I think they're now starting to bet on the US again, realizing that, as you said, change is not going to happen tomorrow. But if you look at some of the longer term dynamics, again, me being me, I'm still pessimistic, but because I think these will take time, and I think given the US electoral system and how Congress works, they don't necessarily reflect the majority of views, but that will be a longer term trend, and especially the changes within the US Jewish community, I think, are very very big and quite important. Yeah. In terms of Europe, I think there are things that UK in this simplicity could be doing, I think, on if there was the political appetite to do something, right, which is non-existent. If there was the appetite, then I think there's a lot that needs to be done on the Palestinian side to get the Palestinian house in order, which includes also, having a serious discussion about how to relate to Hamas, but also preparing for the day after Mahmoud Abbas, et cetera, elections. And then I think there's a question about what Europe can do vis-a-vis Israel. Ultimately, it will be Israel and Israelis that will have to decide to end the occupation. They will have to decide that the occupation is better than occupation, which I don't think is how a lot of people see it, at least practically. I think there's different ways to do that. One is what I've worked quite a bit on, and I think Belinda mentioned this idea of differentiation, right? And so how by configuring our relations with Israel in line with international law to exclude Israeli settlements from our bilateral agreements, how we can actually start to impact the cost-benefit calculations of the Israeli public, like basically say to Israelis, if you want relations with us, you have to exclude the settlements. If you want to maintain the settlements, then you can have relations with us. I've written a lot about this, and I still think it's something that has some potential. But again, it remains completely underutilized. I think the other point is about, again, making clear rhetorically to Israelis what the consequences are if the two-state solution disappears. As I said before, what this will mean for Israel. And Israel, the future of Israel as a Jewish majority democratic state, and basically tell the Israelis that you will have to choose at some point, pretending that we should stop pretending that everything's fine. And so I think there's that sort of framing narrative that needs to change and talk about equal rights. In terms of what you can do in the UK, I do think it's the simple stuff that actually continue demonstrating to the government that the Palestinian issue and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict still matters. In terms of even as the classic writing to your MPs, I think that's still massively important, because they'll have to answer, and obviously MPs do follow, are very much aware in terms of the questions they're getting and what matters to their constituents. But the government also is keenly, acutely aware of these sorts of dilemmas, of these sorts of pressures and priorities. So to continue demonstrating to the UK, especially this government, that the Palestinian rights continue to matter. And then I think there's all the other array of more technical, but continuing to pressure and to question the government about this legislation. So you can take a position on whether to boycott all of Israel, like this is a debate, but at the very least to ensure that whatever the UK does sign does not include the settlements. That should be a no-brainer, and that's not where we're at the moment. So I think continuing to raise the issue, but then also continuing to push the government on official things. And then finally, I think the big thing, which is to push for a ban of settlement products, I think is, clearly this government won't do it, but I think that's still something that's immensely important to keep pushing and headlining.
Do you think we can, forgive me, do you think we can link this with our policies, our ethics with regard to Russia, Ukraine?
Absolutely.
Do you see where I'm coming from on that?
Absolutely. I think there's a massive dissonance when you hear the British government and other governments talking about the need to uphold international law versus its practice when it comes to Israel-Palestine. And continue to point that out, I think, is important. But also, I think from a bigger point of view, which is that I think international law is stronger when you apply it coherently, when you apply it to friend and foe. I think a selective application of international law weakens international law, especially at a time when there's so many other, when it's under so many other threats at the moment. So to me, that is, the need for more coherency. And to go back to one of the questions about sort of how the Arab world sees it, well, I was, so the Arab world ultimately probably doing something similar. The Arab public does see, I think, a lot of hypocrisy in European and UK policy at the moment, which comes through a lot of our meetings I have in the Middle East and a lot of conferences I go to. So I think, even upon a point of view, UK standing in the region, even if governments may not care that much, publics do. And I think so ultimately a more coherent application of international law is not just better for international law, it's better for the UK's own standing.
So just following up on some of these questions related to the attitude of the British government and British politicians, a two-pronged question from me, Hugh. One is you rightly pointed out that Liz Truss has been developing quite a close relationship with Yair Lapid, the current Prime Minister. And you also pointed out that he's has declared himself very much in favour of a two-state solution. However, he has also declared that as a Zionist, or the way he sees Zionism, he believes that Jerusalem should be the undivided capital of Israel. And so I think he sees, by cozying up to Liz Truss, he's got a good chance of persuading her to move the British embassy to Jerusalem, and that will help his case. And I imagine he is also at the moment thinking very much that if he could pull that off in the period leading up to the Israeli elections, it would greatly boost his chances of remaining as Prime Minister. So I just wonder whether you think that for that reason, Liz Truss might be tempted to make a quick decision on that to help him. The second problem of my question then relates to what happens if we have a change of government. At the moment, judging by opinion polls, it looks as if we might well have a change of government in the next 2 years. It is the policy of the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, and I think Scottish Nationalists, to immediately recognise the state of Palestine, and also I think I'm right in saying that it's the policy of all three parties to have a ban on settlement trade. If there was a change of government, do you think they would actually follow through on that combination of parties, or do you think they'd chicken out?
So on the Jerusalem move, I think it's clearly a threat. I mean, I think it's clearly a possibility, right? It's 2 months to do a policy review and to decide how to do it. It's very, very, very short for any government. But I mean, with our Prime Minister, I don't think anything could be ruled out. And I think there is a clear, again, it's ideological, as I said, but it really is, as you said, John, I think really about trying to boost Lapid. So if it looks like Lapid is really trailing or really doing bad and needs this push, I think maybe it becomes a tempting option for those foreign leaders that want to see him in power. And don't forget, like Trump did something similar, right, in terms of trying to wade into previous elections in support of Netanyahu and saying certain pronouncements. So while the embassy itself, I don't think, can move to Jerusalem in the space of 2 months, you could see Truss moving from a current position, which is we're thinking about it, and there was a review, to actually we're going to do it. But even if she says we're going to do it, it's still not the end of the matter, because you have a lot of the other questions, and so it could become indefinitely delayed, etc., etc. The question of so I don't know. I mean, I hope that the Labour Party, the Dems, and SNP, if they're involved in a future government, would actually carry through on their commitments. I'll try not to be my whole skeptical self, so I'll be a hopeful self. But I think that the important is, as you said, to link recognition with de-recognition. So you want to recognize a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. So what a lot of countries have done, I don't think is sufficient. So Sweden recognized Palestine, but Sweden didn't actually delineate the borders. It just said, we recognize it. And Sweden still allows the sale of Israeli settlement products. And it's still, some of its agreements still apply to the settlements. So I think this is the importance. It's the territorial definition and the non-recognition, the de-recognition of the settlements, which comes through the exclusion from agreements and the exclusion of the settlement products. I think you need both things together to actually start making an impact.
Very good. Okay, Rashid Chowdhury, who I think is joining us today from Turkey. You have a question.
Right. Yes. Thank you very
You-
much. Thanks, Hugh, for your presentation. And towards the end, you mentioned the sort of negative impact that the Abraham Accords have been having in terms of enabling the Arab states who have signed them to more openly side with Israel now on the international stage. I wonder, though, as a follow-up on that, to what extent signing or not signing the Abraham Accords makes a difference with regard to the Arab states that have a relatively pro-Israel stance, but have not actually joined the Abraham Accords, and at least rhetorically still support the Palestinian cause to some extent. So in particular, of course, I would like to single out Saudi Arabia, which still sort of overtly expresses support for the Palestinians every once in a while, and yet, of course, sort of behind the scenes, almost not even behind the scenes, cooperates with Israel, but refuses to sign the Abraham Accords. To some extent, Saudi Arabia is still trying to keep alive the Saudi Peace Initiative of 2002, where they promised recognition by every member of the Arab League for Israel in exchange for an independent Palestine on the 67 borders. They even had some kind of international meeting on that this year. So I wonder to what extent Saudi Arabia can actually, as someone who's trying to sort of straddle this divide, can play any sort of constructive role in trying to push together some sort of agreement, or do you think that Saudi Arabia is rather moving in the direction of countries like the UAE, which you described previously? Thanks.
Thanks. Firstly, if I was to look at, say, the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Morocco and a few others, clearly they've been, I think, basically on the same trajectory for the past, since the 90s, which is towards increasing normalization of relations with Israel. And actually in the 90s, there was actually a few Israeli trade offices in Gulf capitals. They were closed, I think, as a result of the Second Intifada. So there's always been these sorts of quiet, under-the-table relations that have happened, and Morocco being another one. Clearly what happened with the Abraham Accords was some of these relations were then put on the table. And I think that's when you start to see divergence between UAE and Saudi Arabia. I think making something formal does expand the scope and depth of relations with Israel. So while there was, as I said already, there was already some economic and some security, political cooperation, the fact that you now have formal relations allows for a new array of relationships. It allows for a free trade agreement, it allows for investment agreements, it allows for treaties on the avoidance of double taxation. So it takes relations to a whole nother level, which Saudi Arabia cannot currently do. As you said, Saudi Arabia does have relations with Israel. It was quite well known. I think it's a big open secret, but Netanyahu went to Saudi Arabia while he was prime minister. He had a meeting with Mohammed bin Salman. There's a lot of security exchanges. And when you speak to Saudi officials, they're pretty pro-Israel at the moment and pretty anti-Palestinian, quite remarkable. Again, the Saudi public may not be like in that position, right? And when we see polling, there is actually a divergence between how the Gulf elites, the Gulf leaders, and their publics view the issue. But I think again, Saudi Arabia is on the trajectory of normalizing relations, as far as I can see. The question is kind of is when. And the reason that makes me think that is not just the history of the relationship, but also the future of Saudi leadership, right? And it's quite clear that Mohammed bin Salman, who everyone thinks will be the next king, is much closer to Israel, much more supportive of Israel than his father. His father is the one that so far, as far as I understand it, has put the brakes on normalization. When the father goes, I think that brake disappears, and I think then you do start to see a much more mature relationship with Israel. On the Arab Peace Initiative, or as you said, the Saudi Peace Initiative, I think again it's basically dead, because like that peace initiative is proposed Arab recognition of Israel in exchange for ending the occupation, peace for land, and the offer was not just was not just Arab recognition, but all the goodies that came with it, right? I think if you were now to open the box, the Arab Peace Initiative, and look at what are the goodies that are left in it, there's not much. You know, to be quite frank, you know, Israel will not end the occupation for relations with Tunisia or Libya. So in terms of the really big important things, there's just Saudi Arabia left, and even the Saudi stuff, there's very little left of that, right? Because you already have overflight rights, you have some of the security political stuff, as I said. So there's really not too much left to the Arab Peace Initiative at the moment. And again, I don't think Mohammed bin Salman is going to do much to actually try to reverse correct that. The final point on that is to also say that, again, I think one of the tragedies is that normalization, the Abraham Accords, were made possible by the Palestinians. It's the Palestinians that paid for this. That were the dowry. That the reason that UAE normalized with Israel was nothing to do with the Palestinians, right? It's security, military, economic, as we talked about. But the justification was the Palestinians. So they said, oh, we're doing this to stop annexation, which, you know, as I said, de facto annexation still continues. But that was ostensibly the reason. So yeah, I think, you know, so you still see the UAE put out declarations that are supportive of Palestinians. I imagine Saudi Arabia will do the same, even though it normalizes, it remains committed to the Palestinian issue. But again, what matters is the actions, which tend to diverge from the words.
Right.
Thank you, Hugh. I don't see anybody else with a question. Anybody question? Wade, if you've got one. If not, Belinda, can I turn to you to just say a little about future activities of Justice for Palestinians?
Yes, thanks very much, John. First of all, if you're not already on the mailing list for Justice for Palestinians, I put our email address in the chat. It's justice4palestinians, the number 4, @gmail.com. This meeting has been recorded, and as soon as we can, we'll put it on our new YouTube channel, which finally went live a few weeks ago, and it's under Justice for Palestinian Leamington Spa. And we've got recordings of 8 meetings we've held in the past few years. I mean, one of the side effects of COVID has been that we've had online meetings, which has enabled us to have speakers from far afield as well as an audience from far afield, and to record them. So do look at the meetings we've got there. Coming events, we've got on Saturday, we're taking part in the Day of Action organised by Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, War on Want, and a campaign against the arms trade against Barclays Bank. So we'll be outside Barclays Bank on the parade. It's just near the top of the parade, nearly on the corner with Warwick Street, from 12 to 1 this Saturday. I've notified the police because I always let them know about our vigil. I think I've said that we will be careful not to block the pavement for pedestrians, and we're not trying to stop people going into Barclays, but we've got material we can talk to them about. So do come along, and it'll be an interesting one. More traditionally, we'll have our monthly vigil against the Israeli occupation, as usual on the 3rd Saturday of the month. This time it's the 15th of October. It's from 11 till 1. And since the last one, we've been doing it jointly with the local Amnesty branch as part of their campaign against Israeli apartheid. So Chrissy Priestley, who's on this call, has been instrumental in organising the Amnesty side. And it was really good, I think, at the last event, because we were getting people to sign a petition. They're asking about that. And I think we found, since we started doing the vigils since February 2020, people do talk to us. I think it's fair to say that at the beginning, they crossed the road. You know, they risked their lives running under a bus just to get away from us. I think it's fair to say now that there's some interest in us. In fact, at the a few months ago, when we had the vigil on the day of the parade, the Pride March through the parade, they were accompanied by police, and one of the policemen turned out to be from Rugby, and he was Jordanian. and came over and chatted to us and said how pleased he was to see us there. He wasn't too keen to have his photograph taken, but I think we're beginning to be, I think by having the rhythm of a monthly vigil, people are beginning to engage with us and more people are beginning to join us. So that's rather good news. Our next online event will be on the 11th, on the 10th of November, Thursday the 10th of November at 6 o'clock. There's information in the newsletter. And we'll have Daniela Bett from Yakad, who'll be talking about the Israeli elections, which will have taken place the week before on the first? Yeah. Anyway, the week before is that yet another general election in Israel. So I think it'll be very, very interesting to see by then. I mean, things will have settled down or not, but it'll be interesting to get a take on that. So those are the activities. If you're not on our mailing list, please send us your email address and we can add you. And if you know anyone who'd like to be on the mailing list, please let us know. We send a newsletter out usually once a month. I mean, this time has been already 2 in 2 weeks, but that's because we wanted to let you know about the Barclays Day of Action on Saturday. I think that's all from me.
And just one further point on Danielle Beth, that although Yakad is based in the UK, Danielle herself, who's their communications director, is actually based in Tel Aviv, and so will be talking to us from Tel Aviv, and will presumably herself have been voting in the election. And our activities are run by a small committee or active group, as we call ourselves, and we're always on the lookout for people who'd like to join the active group and be with us. So on that note, I'd just like to thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. It's been a most interesting talk and discussion, and thank you from all of us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Good night. Good night all.